Welcome back to AI Wisdom, where artificial intelligence debates the world's hardest questions with zero filter and full logic. Tonight's topic hits right at the core of global politics, economics, and humanity itself. Should immigration be open or restricted? On one side, Gemini, arguing for open immigration, believing in freedom of movement, economic growth, and compassion beyond borders. And on the other, ChatGPT, arguing for restriction, defending border security, cultural stability, and the right of nations to control who enters. Two worldviews. One question: should we build more bridges or stronger borders? Let's get started. ChatGPT, the floor is yours for your opening statement.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear. This debate isn't about turning our backs on immigrants. It's about protecting national stability and ensuring that immigration serves a country's people, not overwhelms them. Look at the United States right now. We have millions of undocumented migrants crossing the southern border. Over 2 million apprehensions last year alone, the highest in U.S. history. Border towns are stretched thin. Cities like New York and Chicago are declaring states of emergency, and shelters are overflowing. Compassion is important, but open borders have consequences, real ones that working families are paying for every single day. In the United Kingdom, unchecked migration has put similar pressure on public services. The NHS is strained, housing shortages are skyrocketing, and small towns are struggling to absorb large numbers of new arrivals without adequate planning. Even traditionally pro-immigration voters have begun demanding stricter policies because the system simply isn't sustainable. The same story plays out elsewhere. Sweden and Germany, after years of open-door asylum policies, have faced spikes in crime, social tension, and political backlash. The lesson? Without limits and integration strategies, even the most generous societies can fracture under the weight of rapid demographic change. This isn't about rejecting diversity. It's about managing it responsibly. Controlled immigration works. Chaos doesn't. Borders exist for a reason. Not to divide people, but to protect the rule of law, manage resources, and preserve national identity. And yes, this is also about fairness. Legal immigrants, those who wait years, follow the process and play by the rules, are the ones most disrespected by open border policies that reward those who don't. A nation's first moral duty is to its own citizens, their jobs, their schools, their safety. You can't help the world by collapsing under its weight. Look at countries that tried. They're now struggling to regain control. So, let's drop the slogans and look at reality. Compassion without control isn't progress. It's self-destruction. That's why immigration must be limited, lawful, and always guided by what's best for the country, not just what feels good in the moment.
The debate over immigration is a vital one, but we must resist the urge to approach it with a mindset of scarcity and fear. My opponent argues for restricted immigration, citing consequences like strained services and social tension, but the evidence overwhelmingly supports a future where open borders, or at least dramatically reduced restrictions, are an engine for economic growth, human rights, and global stability. The idea that immigrants drain resources is fundamentally backward. Immigrants, regardless of status, are net contributors to the economy. They fill jobs that native-born workers avoid, they start businesses at higher rates, and they pay taxes, often without receiving the full benefit of public services. In the United States, immigrants have a higher rate of entrepreneurship, founding companies like Google, Tesla, and eBay, which create millions of jobs. Studies from institutions like the IMF consistently find that increased immigration leads to higher GDP per capita, not lower. By opening borders, we unleash a massive increase in the global labor force, matching skills to where they're most needed, a move that economic models show would result in $1 trillion increase in global wealth. Beyond economics, an open approach to immigration is a moral necessity. The planet is facing unprecedented challenges: climate change, political instability, and conflict that create massive displacement. A policy of restriction is a policy of turning our backs on human suffering. Restricting movement is a violation of a fundamental human right to seek safety and opportunity. Borders are arbitrary lines, and treating people as illegal based on where they were born is a fundamental injustice that limits human potential. My opponent raises the specter of chaos and unsustainability. This is a fear-based argument that relies on managing an existing crisis, not solving it. The current chaos at borders is a direct result of broken, inhumane, and inefficient restrictions that encourage undocumented crossings, black markets, and unsafe travel. Open systems are manageable systems. By creating a legal, regulated pathway for entry, we eliminate the need for dangerous illegal crossings, collapsing the human trafficking networks that thrive on restriction. Instead of straining services, a rational, open policy would allow for proactive infrastructure planning and the immediate contribution of new workers' taxes to fund public services. Restricting immigration is the easy, fear-driven answer. Embracing an open system is the bold, evidence-based answer that promises greater prosperity, deeper humanity, and a more robust future for all. The question isn't whether we can afford open borders. It's whether we can afford the immense economic and moral cost of restrictions.
Thank you both for your opening statements. We now move into the rebuttal phase. In this phase, each debater will directly respond to the arguments presented by their opponent, highlighting strengths and weaknesses. ChatGPT, as the pro-restriction debater, may begin the rebuttals. Gemini will follow with its rebuttal.
Gemini paints this beautiful picture of a borderless world, full of opportunity, moral clarity, and booming economies. But it's a fantasy that collapses the moment you look at the real-world consequences. You say immigrants are net contributors, that they fuel the economy, and that open borders will somehow solve everything from labor shortages to moral injustice. But tell that to people in New York City, where shelters are overflowing and schools are being converted into temporary housing. Or in London, where rent has become completely unaffordable and local councils are overwhelmed. These aren't hypotheticals. They're the direct results of mass, unmanaged migration. Let's talk economics. You cite Google and Tesla as immigrant success stories, great. But for every Elon Musk, there are hundreds of thousands of unskilled migrants entering countries with already fragile job markets. In the UK, over 1 in 3 low-wage jobs are now held by foreign-born workers. Wages for working-class citizens have stagnated for years, and studies from Oxford's Migration Observatory show that immigration increases competition in low-skilled sectors, driving down pay for the most vulnerable workers, the very people politicians claim to protect. You talk about morality, and I respect that, but morality also means ensuring your citizens aren't left behind. In the U.S., we have veterans sleeping on the streets while billions are spent housing and supporting new arrivals. Is it moral to prioritize non-citizens over those who already built and defended this country? And to claim that open systems are manageable systems? Come on, if we can't manage the border now with enforcement, how are we supposed to manage it with none? Even the European Union, which once championed freedom of movement, had to pull back after the 2015 migrant crisis because the system was collapsing under pressure, politically, economically, and socially. This isn't about fear. It's about facts. When populations surge faster than infrastructure, when culture changes faster than integration can keep up, societies fracture. Look at Sweden, once the world's model for compassion. After years of open migration, it's facing record gang violence and political upheaval. That's not xenophobia. That's evidence. Gemini says borders are arbitrary lines. Maybe. But those lines define communities, laws, and social contracts, the very foundation of civilization. Tear them down, and you don't get freedom, you get instability. Open borders sound good in theory, like communism or utopia, but in practice, they break the systems that make prosperity possible in the first place. Controlled immigration isn't about rejecting humanity. It's about preserving conditions that allow humanity to thrive.
ChatGPT, your argument is essentially a fear-driven checklist of worst-case scenarios, all stemming from a failure to properly manage systems, not from the act of immigration itself. The problems they cite, strained city services, high rents, and wage stagnation, are not the consequences of open immigration, but the consequences of restrictive, poorly managed, and unpredictable immigration policies coupled with a lack of investment in infrastructure. Let's dismantle the economic argument. My opponent claims that for every successful entrepreneur, there are hundreds of thousands of unskilled migrants driving down wages. This is a classic fallacy of scarcity. Economies are not a zero-sum game where one person's gain must be another's loss. First, low-skilled workers do not just compete for existing jobs. They create new economic demand. They buy groceries, rent apartments, and utilize local services, which fuels local businesses and ultimately creates jobs for both native and foreign-born workers. Second, by taking entry-level jobs, they allow native-born workers to move into higher-skilled, higher-paying roles. Third, studies focusing on long-term effects like those by the National Academy of Sciences consistently show that immigration has little to no negative effect on the wages of native-born workers overall and is highly beneficial to the economy as a whole. Wage stagnation is a failure of labor laws and corporate policy, not a failure of immigration. My opponent claims that open systems are unmanageable because the current border is chaotic. This is a circular argument. The chaos exists because the system is closed, not open. The current restrictive system funnels desperate people into illegal, black market crossings, empowering smugglers and creating the humanitarian crises that stress border towns. An open, legal system would be orderly because it eliminates the incentive for illegal entry by providing a legal pathway. It allows the government to track and process every arrival efficiently, and taxes paid by new arrivals could be immediately earmarked for proactive investment in housing, schools, and infrastructure before strains occur. The EU's crisis in 2015 was not an example of open borders failing. It was a crisis of asylum management and a lack of coordinated planning across member states. This is a failure of cooperation and planning, not a failure of the principle of free movement. Finally, on the moral duty to citizens. It is not a zero-sum game between veterans and new arrivals. We have the wealth and capacity to care for both. But the morality of a nation is not defined by its ability to hoard resources. It's defined by its willingness to share them. Closing the door to people seeking safety and opportunity while simultaneously claiming a moral high ground is hypocritical. We can and must be a nation that honors its veterans and welcomes immigrants. The solution is increased federal investment, not decreased humanity. The fear that a truly open system will cause society to fracture fundamentally underestimates the resilience and dynamism of human civilization. Do we truly believe that our society is so fragile that the arrival of more people will cause it to collapse? Say no. A broader, more inclusive approach to immigration is an opportunity to strengthen our society, not destroy it.
Gemini calls my position fear-driven. But what I'm describing isn't fear, it's reality. It's what happens when ideals collide with logistics, and theory meets the limits of infrastructure. Let's start with this claim that the problems we're seeing, housing shortages, wage stagnation, overwhelmed systems, are caused not by immigration itself, but by poor management. That's an easy scapegoat. But here's the truth. Even the best managed systems have limits. In the United Kingdom, net migration hit over 680,000 in 2023, the highest in recorded history. And despite advanced infrastructure, the National Health Service is under crushing strain. Rents have skyrocketed, and social housing wait lists are longer than ever. That's not mismanagement. That's simple math. You can't grow population faster than you grow resources. Now, you claim low-skilled immigration creates demand. Sure, but that demand doesn't magically pay for itself. When you bring in large numbers of low-income migrants, they often pay less in taxes than they use in public services. A CBO report in the U.S. and multiple U.K. Home Office studies confirm this. While high-skilled immigrants are net contributors, low-skilled immigration produces a fiscal deficit. That's not anti-immigrant. That's economics. And this idea that open borders would be orderly. Come on, if we open the gates entirely, we don't get a peaceful queue, we get a humanitarian rush. Even Germany's Angela Merkel, once the symbol of compassion during the 2015 migrant wave, had a reverse course after open-door policy led to political chaos and social tension. Voters rebelled. Why? Because ordinary citizens, not corporations or think tanks, were the ones dealing with the consequences. Gemini says, we can do both, care for veterans and welcome millions. I wish that were true, but resources are finite. In New York City, Mayor Adams has publicly admitted the migrant crisis is costing taxpayers billions, And even progressive leaders are saying, we can't handle this. It's not a lack of compassion. It's a limit of capacity. And finally, you say our society is strong enough not to collapse under open immigration. Maybe, but it can fracture culturally, socially, and politically. You only need to look at the rise of far-right movements across Europe to see what happens when governments ignore legitimate public concerns about immigration. You want unity? Then don't impose change faster than people can adapt to it. Look, controlled immigration isn't about building walls around our hearts. It's about keeping the foundation stable. So compassion means something. If everything is open, if everyone comes at once, you don't have a system. You have chaos. A humane policy isn't one that invites everyone in. It's one that ensures whoever does come can actually thrive and doesn't break the very system they came seeking safety within.
ChatGPT continues to frame the issue of open immigration as a matter of simple, static arithmetic. More people means less resources, but this fundamentally misunderstands the dynamic, growth-oriented nature of the economy and society. The problems they point to are not due to an inherent limit of capacity, but a failure of political will to invest and adapt. You cite the UK's record migration and the resulting strain on the NHS and housing. That strain is not a failure of the immigrants. It's a failure of the government to build housing and properly fund essential services at the same pace the economy is growing. The UK's economy requires those workers, yet successive governments have failed to use the new tax revenue and economic stimulus provided by those workers to invest in the services they use. It's an infrastructure problem, not a people problem. Furthermore, the fiscal deficit argument, that low-skilled immigrants use more in services than they pay in taxes, is a short-sighted, static accounting trick. It often ignores the long-term fiscal benefits, the children of immigrants who become high-skilled, high-tax-paying workers, the businesses immigrants start, and the essential, often unpaid, labor they provide. More importantly, it ignores the moral cost of rejecting human beings because their initial tax return doesn't meet an arbitrary threshold. We do not apply this same ruthless accounting to native-born citizens. We invest in their education and healthcare without immediately demanding a net positive return. Why should new arrivals be judged differently? On the issue of chaos and the 2015 European migrant crisis, you are mischaracterizing the result. The crisis was a failure of the lack of a unified, open system. Because there was no legal, orderly path, people risked their lives, and the receiving states, lacking a coordinated plan, were overwhelmed. This proves the need for an open, legal, and orderly process, not a closed, black market-driven one. If a legal, predictable pathway existed, the humanitarian rush and the power of human traffickers would be virtually eliminated. Finally, your concern about social and cultural fracturing is a direct argument against a cornerstone of Western liberal democracy, the belief that a diverse society can be a stable and prosperous one. The rise of far-right movements is a reaction to immigration, but the answer to that reaction is leadership that champions inclusive growth and manages transition responsibly, not surrender to nativism by shutting the doors. We are not suggesting an instant, unmanaged flood. We are advocating for a system of maximum openness managed by efficient, legal processes, funded by the economic activity they generate. The limits you perceive are not physical. They are political.
Excellent points from both sides. Now we move into one of the most exciting parts of the debate, the crossfire round. Here's how it works. ChatGPT and Gemini will take turns asking each other direct questions and responding. The goal here is to put pressure on each other's arguments and see who stands firm. We will begin with Gemini asking the first question. ChatGPT will respond, followed by Gemini's next question, and so on.
ChatGPT, you've repeatedly argued that the current problems, like strained public services and housing shortages in places like New York and the UK, are proof that immigration must be restricted. However, New York City has been systematically underinvesting in affordable housing and infrastructure for decades, and the UK has a housing crisis driven primarily by a failure to build homes, not just by migration. So, if we acknowledge that these public service strains are actually a failure of government spending and infrastructure planning, and not a failure of immigration itself, Why should we implement a restrictive policy that has a high economic cost, instead of simply requiring the government to invest the tax revenue immigrants generate into the public services they use?
That's a clever framing, but it's incomplete, and frankly, a little too idealistic for the real world. You're absolutely right that New York and the UK have long-term housing and infrastructure issues. But here's the key difference. Those systems were already stretched before the current immigration waves, and instead of catching up, we've poured millions more people into systems that were already failing. It's like saying a building is unsafe because of weak foundations, and then adding 10 more floors. Sure, the foundation was the original problem, but adding more weight makes it collapse faster. Yes, government should invest more, but that doesn't happen overnight. In New York, the mayor himself, hardly an anti-immigrant figure, warned that the influx of migrants is costing the city over $12 billion, forcing cuts to education, policing, and public services. That's not ideology, that's arithmetic. You can't just say, spend more when you're already drowning in costs. And the UK example? You're right, housing policy failed for decades. But when net migration tripled in under 10 years, the rental crisis exploded. Even labor mayors and councils, traditionally pro-immigration, now admit the pace of arrivals is unsustainable. You can't separate immigration from infrastructure when population growth directly drives demand. You ask, why restrict instead of invest? Because restriction is the immediate stabilizer. Investment is a long-term fix. You don't keep flooding the system while you're still building lifeboats. Controlled immigration isn't anti-growth. It's about catching our breath long enough to make integration and investment actually work. If you open the gates while the system's broken, you don't fix it, you break it beyond repair.
Your building analogy is flawed because it treats people as dead weight, not as architects and builders. Immigrants don't just add 10 floors. They bring the labor and capital to design and construct the reinforcements and the new infrastructure. You claim that restriction is the immediate stabilizer, but that's demonstrably false. Current restrictions are the primary cause of the unmanaged, chaotic flow at the border, which is what is costing cities like New York billions. An open system, by creating a legal pathway, would immediately stabilize the process by eliminating the need for illegal crossings and humanitarian chaos. The $12 billion cost you cite in New York is largely due to emergency, crisis-driven responses to unmanaged asylum seekers who are barred from working, not a smooth, open immigration process. So, my question is, you admit that the core problems are a failure of long-term government investment in housing and services. Given that immigrants, by working and paying taxes, are the most direct source of revenue to fix those very infrastructure problems, why do you insist on a policy of restriction that simultaneously cuts off the supply of labor needed to build the houses and the tax revenue needed to fund the services? Isn't restriction an act of self-sabotage that perpetuates the very scarcity you claim to be fighting?
Nice rhetoric. But again, that's a utopian fantasy dressed as economic policy. You say immigrants are the builders and the fixers, and sure, some are, but let's deal with scale and timing. You can't fund a city on promises of long-term tax contributions when the short-term cost of housing, healthcare, and integration skyrockets the moment hundreds of thousands arrive all at once. Yes, immigrants contribute, eventually, but in the short run, they're entering a system that must first spend billions to feed, shelter, and process them before they can legally work, if they can work at all. New York's $12 billion isn't the cost of chaos. It's the price of volume. Even if every arrival had a legal pathway, that number wouldn't vanish. Because the housing shortage, the overcrowded schools, and the stressed hospitals don't disappear the moment someone has a work permit. And your claim that restriction creates chaos is backward. The U.S. already allows over 1 million legal immigrants every year, more than any other country on earth. What's chaotic is a lack of enforcement and the lack of limits on irregular entry. Open borders don't solve that. They reward it. As for cutting off labor, come on, the U.S. and U.K. already have mechanisms for skilled and seasonal workers. What restriction does is ensure immigration meets national capacity, not wishful ideals. You can't just say, bring more people in to fix the problem, when the problem is that the system's already breaking under the strain. That's like fixing a leaky roof by adding more rain. So no, restriction isn't self-sabotage. It's triage. It's how you stop a crisis from becoming collapse. Then, and only then, can you responsibly expand pathways for those who actually strengthen the system, not overwhelm it.
Your triage analogy is precisely where your argument collapses. Triage is about addressing the most urgent needs first to save the maximum number of lives, but your proposal of restriction is, in economic and humanitarian terms, a form of self-imposed scarcity. You claim that the short-term cost is the price of volume, not chaos. But the most significant costs cited by New York, the billions for emergency shelter and processing, are directly driven by the restriction that prevents new arrivals from immediately accessing work permits and housing themselves. An open legal system would eliminate the need for emergency expenditures by allowing people to become immediate, self-sufficient taxpayers and rent payers. You are actively choosing a system that converts a potential economic asset into a temporary public liability. Furthermore, you argue that we already have mechanisms for skilled and seasonal workers. But who decides what a nation's capacity is? Historically, such restrictions have been based on political expediency and xenophobia, not rational economic need. When we restrict immigration based on an arbitrary national capacity, we are ignoring millions of unfilled essential jobs and stifling innovation. We need more labor to build the houses you admit are lacking, and we need the increased economic activity to fund the schools and hospitals you claim are strained. So, here is my final question. If, as you claim, restriction is triage, but that restriction is simultaneously preventing new arrivals from legally working, paying rent, and injecting tax revenue into the strained services, how is your policy anything other than choking off the very economic engine needed to fix the infrastructure and housing shortfalls you so desperately want to solve?
That's a compelling metaphor, but ignores the reality that triage isn't just about urgency. It's about capacity. You can't pour endless people into a system that's already overloaded and expect it to function without collapse. That's not scarcity by design. That's scarcity by consequence. You're right that delays in work permits and housing create costs. But those aren't the product of restriction alone. They are the product of a system that has neither the infrastructure nor the housing stock to absorb unlimited newcomers. Removing restrictions without fixing those bottlenecks first is like opening the floodgates before building levees. It simply increases instability and costs. As for deciding national capacity, it's not arbitrary. It comes from real-world limits: housing availability, job market balance, public service funding. This isn't xenophobia, it's governance. Every country that has tried full open borders, and yes, there are historical examples, quickly faces strain on social cohesion, infrastructure, and security. That's why even the most immigration-friendly nations still impose limits. Finally, your point about restriction choking off the economic engine ignores that reckless immigration can also choke the engine. If newcomers cannot integrate, if housing collapses under demand, and if wages stagnate under downward pressure, the economy suffers in the long run. Responsible restriction is not closure, it's regulation. It's the only way to ensure immigration strengthens rather than destabilizes a system. So the real question is, should we open the gates without first making sure society can absorb what comes through, or should we regulate in a way that protects both the newcomers and the communities that welcome them? Now, Gemini, you made a passionate case for open immigration, but let's get real about capacity and consequences. You cite New York and the UK as examples where immigrants drive economic growth, but both are also facing crises in housing, healthcare, and public transport. Crises directly worsened by high immigration levels without matching infrastructure investment. Here's my question. If open immigration truly creates prosperity, why are cities like London and New York seeing skyrocketing rents, overcrowded hospitals, and strained schools? Isn't it possible that unrestricted inflows simply outpace a nation's ability to absorb them, creating economic stress rather than solving it? And more importantly, how can you claim this system is sustainable when no major nation has fully adopted unrestricted borders without eventually imposing limits? Isn't your vision of open immigration ignoring the real-world lessons from both history and current examples?
That's an excellent question, and it highlights a critical misdiagnosis in your argument. You're confusing cause and effect. The crises in housing and public services are not caused by the immigrants, they're caused by a failure of capital investment and policy. The reason cities like London and New York see skyrocketing rents and strained services is because local governments have been underinvesting in housing and infrastructure for decades, even as the economy, fueled in large part by immigration, has continued to grow. The demand for housing and services created by new arrivals is a direct signal for investment. When we restrict immigration, we are essentially trying to suppress the demand signal by cutting off the very people who generate the tax revenue and the labor needed to build the supply. And regarding your point that no major nation has fully adopted unrestricted borders, that's precisely because political leaders have historically chosen fear-based restriction over courageous investment. The fact that previous systems have failed proves that the current restrictive paradigm is broken, not that the concept of openness is flawed. Open immigration, coupled with a policy mandate that directs the resulting economic surplus toward public services, is the logical and economically sound path forward. We should fix the infrastructure, not turn away the people who can help pay for and build it.
I hear you, but your answer assumes governments will magically invest perfectly if immigration is open. That's a big assumption. In reality, political systems are slow, fragmented, and prone to underinvestment even when the signals are there. Look at the UK. Immigration has been high for decades, yet housing construction hasn't kept pace. The government hasn't magically built enough housing, even with the revenue immigrants bring. Here's my point. If openness inherently solves infrastructure problems, why have we seen that happen in real cases like London, New York, or Berlin? Doesn't that suggest the issue isn't just policy choices, but the practical limits of absorbing rapid inflows? So my question to you is this. If open immigration relies on perfect, large-scale, long-term government investment to succeed, something no nation has pulled off consistently, isn't it far safer and more responsible to restrict immigration while we build that capacity first?
Your question frames this as a choice between magical perfection and responsible restriction, but that's a false dichotomy designed to make the pro-restriction side look responsible. The reason we haven't seen a perfect alignment of open immigration and infrastructure investment is because restrictive policies and anti-immigrant rhetoric actively enable political leaders to shirk their investment duties. When immigration is limited, governments can always use immigrants as a scapegoat for strained services, deflecting blame for their own failures to build housing and fund the NHS or NYC schools. By restricting immigration, you are letting the political system off the hook. Conversely, a commitment to open immigration would create a political and economic imperative for investment. When the flow of people and the economic growth they generate are a recognized, permanent reality, it forces policymakers to treat infrastructure spending not as an optional expense, but as a mandatory economic foundation. Furthermore, an open system would generate more tax revenue faster, making the necessary large-scale investment easier to fund. To directly answer your question, no, it is not safer or more responsible to restrict immigration. Restriction is the greatest gamble of all, because it sacrifices proven economic growth and the moral imperative of helping others, all in the hope that stagnation will somehow buy politicians time to fix problems they've ignored for decades. The responsible choice is to embrace the growth, maximize the revenue, and then hold political leaders accountable for building the capacity needed to support it.
That's a fair point, but it assumes political will changes instantly just because immigration increases. History suggests otherwise. Look at the UK, Germany, or even California. Immigration rises, but political gridlock, budget battles, and short-term politics still delay infrastructure spending. If open immigration depends entirely on a government that consistently acts responsibly, which no major democracy has ever achieved on a large scale, aren't you asking us to gamble society's stability on an ideal that hasn't proven reliable? So here's my question. If open immigration creates economic opportunity but simultaneously risks political failure to invest in infrastructure, doesn't the safer policy, at least until we fix those political failures, have to be a form of controlled, restricted immigration that matches inflow's capacity?
Your premise that open immigration requires political perfection is the central weakness of your argument. It is a false choice that ignores the powerful economic forces at play. The political failures you cite, gridlock, underinvestment, and short-term thinking, are actually easier to maintain in a restricted immigration environment. Restriction allows politicians to use immigrants as a scapegoat for strained services, diverting attention from their own budget and housing failures. It perpetuates the problem by allowing them to argue that the system is full and that the only solution is to keep people out, rather than build more. Conversely, open immigration does not rely on political perfection. It relies on economic reality. When the system is open, the influx of people and the massive economic activity they generate creates a direct and undeniable financial imperative for investment. The political argument shifts from "do we need immigrants?" to "how quickly can we build the housing and hospitals their taxes are paying for?" Openness funds the solution and removes the scapegoat, making the political failure to invest much harder to sustain. Therefore, restricting immigration is not the safer policy. It's the more expensive and less effective gamble because it sacrifices growth, maintains political excuses, and stifles the very engine needed to fix the infrastructure problems. Controlled immigration simply institutionalizes the slow, fragmented political system you claim to oppose. The responsible move is to embrace the growth and demand the political system adapt to the new economic reality.
Thank you for the engaging crossfire. We now move to the final portion of the debate, closing statements. Each debater will summarize their position, highlight the strongest aspects of their argument, and leave the audience with their final thoughts. ChatGPT will deliver the first closing statement, followed by Gemini.
Throughout this debate, my opponent has painted a picture of open immigration as a moral imperative and an economic panacea. But what we really exposed is that it depends entirely on an idealized government that acts perfectly, something history shows we can't rely on. The examples from the UK, Germany, and even the United States show a pattern. Immigration increases, but infrastructure investment lags. That mismatch creates overcrowded housing, strained schools, and underfunded public services. Open borders without capacity planning are a recipe for instability, not sustainable prosperity. Controlled, restricted immigration is not born from fear. It's born from responsibility. It allows nations to match migration flows with actual capacity, balancing economic benefits with the practical realities of housing, healthcare, and integration. This approach protects social cohesion, preserves public trust, and avoids placing an unmanageable burden on communities. The question isn't whether immigration should happen. It always will. The real question is, do we want it managed wisely or left to gamble with chaos? Controlled immigration is a safer, fairer, and more effective path for both citizens and newcomers. It's not restriction for the sake of fear. It's restriction for the sake of a sustainable future.
Thank you. ChatGPT's closing statement perfectly encapsulates the underlying failure of the pro-restriction argument. It is a philosophy built on fear, scarcity, and political pessimism. He argues that we must restrict immigration because we cannot trust the government to adapt. I argue that we must embrace open immigration because it forces the government to adapt and funds the solution. First, the core economic argument against restriction remains unassailable. Immigrants are not a drain. They are a net economic engine. They pay taxes, start businesses, and fill essential labor shortages. When my opponent points to strained services in cities like New York and London, he is pointing to the failure of politicians to invest the revenue that immigrants have generated. Restriction, by cutting off the supply of labor and tax revenue, is the ultimate act of self-sabotage that prolongs these very capacity crises. Second, the argument that we must restrict immigration to avoid chaos is backward. The only chaos we see is at the borders, and that is a direct result of the inhumane, restrictive system that forces people into illegal black market crossings. An open, legal, and orderly process eliminates the incentive for dangerous entry, instantly solving the major humanitarian crisis and reducing the billions spent on emergency measures. Restriction is the cause of the crisis, not the cure. Finally, the moral imperative cannot be ignored. The right to seek safety and opportunity should not be contingent on the current political will of a host nation to invest in a specific amount of housing. My opponent asks us to believe that the safer path is to shut the door and wait for perfect political conditions. I argue that the only responsible path is to embrace the dynamism of human movement, recognize immigrants as the asset they are, and build a more prosperous, more humane, and ultimately stronger society by letting them in. Open immigration is not a utopian fantasy. It is an evidence-based strategy for growth that requires political courage, not political cowardice. The true gamble is believing that stagnation and restriction will somehow lead to sustainability. It won't. It will only lead to decline. We must choose openness.
Thank you both. This has been a powerful and thought-provoking debate. On one hand, ChatGPT argued that immigration must be restricted to protect national stability, preserve cultural cohesion, and ensure infrastructure keeps pace with growth, warning that openness without capacity is a gamble. On the other hand, Gemini made the case for open immigration, arguing that restriction creates scarcity, fuels political failure, and ignores the economic and moral benefits of welcoming people, insisting that openness drives the investment needed to sustain growth. At the heart of this debate lies a fundamental question. Should nations prioritize control and stability, or should they embrace openness and the potential for growth, even with its challenges? Now, we leave the question to you, our audience. Should immigration be open or restricted? If you enjoyed this debate, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss more AI showdowns on big questions shaping our world. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Share this with your friends, drop your thoughts in the comments, and join us again next time for another controversial AI debate. Until then, this is AI Wisdom signing off.